Are you ready to explore how people coordinate, to build and empower your community, to take action and solve problems, to coordinate without any central authority? What? Bringing in the OGs of the pre-crypto decentralized coordination space together with the pioneers of the cutting-edge technologies to fuse their ancient knowledge with the latest tools in order to fight coordination failures, slay Moloch, and continue the endless search for the holy grails of decentralized coordination. Welcome to the front lines of coordination. Fuck. My brain is already melting. I hope you survive. Welcome, Grace, to the frontiers of coordination.
Thank you.
I mean, you've kind of been on the frontiers of coordination for longer than most of the people in the DAO space, and that's pretty much why I invited you to this podcast, to have more people who were into decentralized organizations before DAOs came into existence. You know, like in the DAO space, there's a lot of people who think like this is the first time ever that decentralized organizations are possible. But as you know, it's far from the truth. So yeah, I want to talk to you about things like decentralized organizations versus DAOs and like all the other topics that we're going to mention that I'm not going to mention right now. I just wanted to explain why I invited you here for our listeners, and if you want to give a brief intro to yourself as well.
Yeah, so it's interesting. It's interesting. What do we think? What is a decentralized organization and what is decentralized organizing? And I've definitely been thinking about it for a long time because I started thinking about what would be the ideal form of democracy around the time of the Arab Spring, because I'm Israeli. And I thought, okay, it's great that you overthrow your dictator. And what are you going to put in place? I don't know what. I haven't got an idea. And so this question of decentralized decision-making has been on my mind probably for 13 years. I wrote a book on how to coordinate in that way, which is much more on the soft side, the human side, about 4 years ago. And I've actually been in that space. And I think we all, in some ways, have. If you go to a volunteer organization, there may be a leader, but there's only so much they can tell you to do. And a lot of my training is in something called the Landmarks Team Management and Leadership Program. It's a program where there's rotating leadership. Each quarter, they rotate who the leader is. And so that really gave me a grounding in, hey, it's not a traditional organization. How do you bring out the best in people, bring out everybody's leadership and everybody's skills? And how do you think about leadership in organizations where there isn't one person all the time? And it may be because it's a rotating organization. People come in and out like volunteer organizations and people get tired and leave. Or it may be just because you've decided to do that. And there are examples. I mean, I even talk about my religion that way, right? Judaism is a very long-standing religion, which doesn't have a pope or a leader. It's decentralized. And then you do have coordination issues. It has a protocol. There's 613 laws. So there's a protocol, but it's still like, okay, you have to wear a hat, but what kind of hat? And so you see these interesting coordination issues. And we don't have any voting, right? This kind of decentralized organization doesn't have voting. And in fact, most don't. If you go and do research with intentional communities and movements, which a movement is a kind of a decentralized organization, you find that there's never voting. So it's very interesting that the DAO space has started with voting.
Right. That was actually going to be something I wanted to mention as well, like voting versus simply governing, or not even governing, but like acting and doing things. Like in the DAO space, a lot of the people seem to conflate voting with governance and see that like, okay, if a DAO is decentralized, it means that it's voting and there's a lot of voting happening and all of the community votes on everything and all of that. But when you look at, as you said, like the decentralized organizations in the past, it doesn't necessarily involve voting. Like people do things. They don't have to have everybody vote on every action that's happening.
Yeah. And that's quite profound, right? There's people doing stuff all the time. And the voting isn't necessarily, I mean, what does that mean, voting in that format? And even deciding to have a vote, right? How often are there votes? How big does something have to be to vote on it? Some things are quite obvious. If you're in a family, I remember when I was married, my husband and I deciding on, we were talking about something and I'm like, yeah, but this thing only cost X amount of money. And he's like, yeah, but it's going to be in my house. And I'm like, oh, right. Like, so if you're going to spend more than this amount of money in the organization, and if you've been in a company, it's like that, right? You have a discretionary fund of X, maybe it's $50 that you don't have to ask your boss about. And then if you're a manager, you have another amount of money that you can spend without asking. DAOs haven't really looked at that. And I was recently looking at, I think it was like the Gitcoin funding, or maybe it was one of the Cosmos or Cardano. I've been looking a lot at different things. And there was some approval for a budget of a few $100s. And I thought, wow, that's super inefficient. Organizations don't work by voting. I think it was on Gitcoin grants or something. It was some insignificant, what I think of as an insignificant amount of money that you're voting on. And it's like, well, there should be thresholds and there should be things happening.
Right.
And then even within voting, there's different kinds of voting. Most of the DAOs are using yes, no voting and majority rules voting, and there has to be a quorum. And we'll talk about Priceless in a bit, but we're starting Priceless in a group. We're starting a group there. And basically the idea is if there's no material disagreement, no material objection, then if you propose it, it goes. Now, we're not distributing funds, but again, we're talking about what will we do. And if you want to do something, for example, we created a video together and one of us wrote the script and the other person said, I don't feel uncomfortable. I feel uncomfortable with that. I'm like, well, put in your part. And everybody put in the part they wanted and read the parts that felt right to them. And as long as nobody objected, something might have come out. Somebody's like, I object to that sentence, it would come out. But basically we didn't vote. It was just a consensus like, okay, well, I don't really object to that. It's fine. And so that's a different kind of voting. Like, unless there's objection, it goes forward.
Right.
Yeah, there's also alignment. Like, can you live with it, right?
Yeah, like if you just have voting and majority vote, then like even these issues can just be swept under the rug. Like somebody can bring up an issue, but we're not going to address that. We will just vote, and then if the majority votes yes, then okay, like nobody cares about the issue, which might actually be important. Like maybe not important as like canceling the whole proposal, but it could have been addressed instead of just we're just going to vote and like it's going to pass. But yeah, it looks like a lot of DAOs are also evolving to this kind of a pod structure that gives more authority to these different subgroups to do make decisions on their own. And like we also like up until very recently we had the same system of like have to vote on every $50 or $100 that you want to spend, and it's just so cumbersome like having everything go through voting. But yeah, besides that, what are some of the other bigger differences between decentralized organizations in the past and versus like what's happening now in the DAO space?
Oh, there's one other kind of voting I just want to mention, which is Joke DAO, which I think is fantastic. I mean, it's just fun because it's a joke, but they have ranked votings. So they have weekly contests and then the most points wins. And that makes sense for choosing the best art, choosing the best of many proposals, which I think is much better than yes, no. It's like, okay, here's 5 proposals that are on the table to solve X problem. Let's vote on the best one. So Joke DAO is actually, although it's called Joke DAO and they mostly vote on jokes, which are mostly bad jokes, it could be used for anything that you wanted ranked voting on. And Dash has a similar thing, like the best proposals float to the top and then the top ones get funded until the funds run out. And so that kind of ranked voting is also very useful. I mean, I think when you say decentralized organization, right, it's what do you mean? Because this sub DAO thing, as soon as you say sub, well, it's kind of a hierarchy, right? Because there's a main DAO, which is we're all moving towards this goal. And that main DAO is funding the sub DAOs. And so now you've reinvented hierarchy. That's interesting. And you could say Well, not exactly, because each of the pods is independent. So now you've reinvented sociocracy. And so, right? And sociocracy and holacracy are sort of flavors of something that has always been the way everything that's large has to organize. You've got the marketing department and you've got the R&D department, and they know how to do different things. And if it's a neighborhood sociocracy, you've got the committee on the pets, and you've got the committee on the gardens, and you've got the committee on the, and they're equal in some way in terms of their authority. The pets group doesn't have any authority over the garden group, but they probably have to talk because if the pet is doing its thing in the garden or digging up the garden, right, there's some overlap, but it's not that one has authority over the other. But that's a sociocratic system. And some of it has to do with what you're doing. When you think about building movements like Extinction Rebellion, well, that's more of a decentralized organization. They do have a leadership and they deploy actions, but the physical actions, each one of those locations, again, that could be called a pod. But if you're at, because we met last time, we were at ReFi, what was it?
At the Crypto Commons gathering.
It was a crypto, no, we met last time in Berlin at the
The Regions Unite. Yeah.
Regens Unite, right? And there was a regen there. There was a participant who was from the Extinction Rebellion Berlin. And that individual did not know what the activity was that they were going to be doing on, I think it was the Saturday or the Sunday, but he knew where he and a certain number of people were supposed to meet. And then presumably somebody else in a different pod knew where they were supposed to meet. And then when they got there, then they would receive the instructions for what the coordinated activity would be. And that's kind of an underground movement type of organization of a decentralized organization. So while you could think of, certainly Extinction Rebellion started somewhere, but at this moment, I don't think that they have any type of centralized control over what's going on. And then each pod has these decentralized units that are going to decide on different actions, and you show up. Now, when you show up, you might be like, oh, I'm not doing that, right? I'm not going to spill Campbell's soup on the Van Gogh painting, or I'm not going to graffiti because I personally don't align with that action. But these actions are decided in different places, and they're part of this. I mean, that the Campbell soup thing, right? It's kind of part of Extinction Rebellion, but it's not controlled from the center, and maybe they don't even condone it. And so it's very interesting to see that when you're a movement, it kind of has this decentralized nature to it. And then, like I said, some pods may be more of an underground nature, and other pods might just be some people, we align with the cause and we're going to do this action. And then the centralized organization or the leaderships might say, we don't align with that. Yeah, and that's interesting. The civil rights movement in the United States was a little bit like that. And you had people like Malcolm X, and then you had people like Martin Luther King, and they kind of knew that one was helpful to the other. So if you're a nonviolent person like Martin Luther King, it does help you that there's some people who are willing to be more extreme, because then the authorities are like, okay, we don't want to talk with those Malcolm X people. We better compromise with the more moderate people. So they're part of the same movement. We deserve equality movement with different actions towards an outcome. And so you could call that a decentralized movement as well. It all really depends on what you're doing. And a lot of these things that are calling themselves DAOs, they don't really have an interest in that kind of decentralization, because they're much more about the power of the organization itself. Whereas the civil rights movement or Extinction Rebellion, they're not trying to build the power into the organization. They're trying to evoke change outside. And so those are very different types of thinking about what decentralization might look like.
Right. Yeah, it becomes a question like, who has the autonomy? Like, is it the people or is it the organization itself? And like in a DAO space, you may have like a lot of DAOs do with this token weighted voting, and then like people just buy votes and you end up with a plutocracy. And it's like, okay, like so what's the decentralized bit? And then it turns out it's just the fact that it's happening on a blockchain. Like there's no like actually decentralized, like the organization itself or the people are not autonomous. But you also touched up in like on an important point about like with Extinction Rebellion and like destroying the paintings. And like in that case, you have like the people on the edges have so much autonomy that they can like do whatever they want, and they can even bring shame to the whole movement. Like they can represent the movement in a bad way that like changes the public perception of the movement, but the movement itself is so decentralized that there is no way to like stop these things from happening, or like declaring that like the movement itself doesn't condone this kind of behavior. So that's also interesting. Like it's kind of a fine balance.
It is. I do want to say something specifically about that. I'm not clear that the painting was destroyed, but I am clear about something, which is terrorist actions have been a feature of movements like this forever. And the people who created that action, it's not a terrorist action. Those people were girls, right? They were female people. And we're so outraged by that, but yet we have all kinds of people doing bombings and destructions who tend not to be female people, doing all types of terrorist actions, whether that's the IRA in Ireland or the Palestinians in the Middle East, or it could be anywhere, right? We've had terrorist organizations who are freedom fighters everywhere in the world. And there's a real difference between that type of action, like I spilled soup on a painting and I blew up a bus. So I want to be really clear about the level of outrage that we have. And there's a real difference between I destroyed a Van Gogh painting and I created an oil spill that killed thousands of living beings. And so this outrage about that particular incident seems to me out of balance with the severity of that particular act and the severity of the damage being done by the things that they're trying to oppose. So it's very interesting how much, again, that's completely off our topic, but I don't think people realize how they've been perceiving that particular act, like how horrible it was or was not.
Right. That's a great point, actually. And it generated like more attention than like the random oil spill in Africa or whatever. Like a lot more people heard about this, which is like compared to other stuff that's happening is kind of completely insignificant.
Yeah. And that's the point of terrorism, right? The point of terrorism is to bring attention when you're the underdog. And they didn't kill anybody for that. It's pretty good form of terrorism. If you're going to do, not that terrorism is good, but if you're going to do terrorism, that one's like, okay, no creatures got killed.
True.
Yeah. So it's true. And like I said, having those extremists helps the middle ground.
I hope so.
Yeah. So now I forgot what your question was, of course.
And I was just talking about this fine balance of like having extreme autonomy on the edges versus like being able to like influence at least to a degree to like how people within the organization act. And I guess it also depends like whether it's an organization or whether it's a movement. Where like organizations, it makes more sense to have these more clearer boundaries, whereas with movements, like it makes sense that it's completely decentralized, maybe.
Yeah. And is a federation a DAO? I mean, that's one of the things that is really big curiosity now. Now we're starting to have like these DAO to DAO abilities. And if you look at Regen's Unite, my question has been, what do you mean by unite? And would a DAO structure allow these multiple regenerative movements to federate in some sort of meaningful way, each one being able to express its individualism, but also maybe that's not one of the things that we've had in the nonprofit world. So let's say you've got a problem like, oh, the planet is in, planetary survival is an issue. You really do want all the regenerators to unite. And if it's just a general movement, then you're missing something. But if DAOs can offer us some structure where we could recognize one another, be united under some sort of federated protocol that allows us to communicate. The question would be, what do you want to communicate? And then allows us to say, hey, we're going to pool all of our budgets for all the regenerators, and we're going to look at which of the things over the last 6 months was the most effective. And we're going to have you'll be able to actually see some sort of dashboard which will give you the information. These are things we're never possible for. Right? Which of these things is actually causing the outcome that we want for the planet? And then that would help us move our funds. I think one of the things that we've really missed in the DAO movement is decision making is informed or not informed. And the place that you get your information is really important. And so that communications and media and input network is really important. What did we do over the last 6 months? Which one of these people is authoritative? Just yesterday, Gitcoin announced these people on this council that I didn't know of, and I wish I had applied. But when I looked at the list of the people on the council, I thought, oh yeah, these are good people. I know them. They're the right people to be elected. And that's when whoever took that vote had to look at those names and not just read what the person had done, but look through to the links, and maybe they actually knew the person. And so all of the information that comes into your vote is very interesting. And I don't think we have good systems for that. And you know that because Griff Green had to write a whole description of why he should be elected. It's like, come on.
Right. Yeah. There's like really the beginning of this sort of inter-DAO collaboration. Like we were trying to do it for a while, like bringing these like a bunch of DAOs together, and we brought like 30. But it's hard to get anything going between the DAOs, because even like coordination between like within the DAOs is still pretty hard, and it's so early that like between the DAOs it's still like kind of out of the question. It's hard to get people to even like focus on that. And then like Bloom Network has kind of been doing that even before the DAO space, with like supporting these local regenerative movements. But then in that kind of domain, and well, in DAOs in general, it's like the money becomes a problem. Like you have people who are motivated to do things, but there's a general lack of money. And like I think it's also no wonder that like the DAO space seems to be the least funded part of crypto. Like in crypto, everybody wants to support the revolution, like insofar as it makes them rich. That kind of seems to be the case. So it's I think funding is definitely a part of the problem, but yeah, just the fact that the tools are so early. But yeah, that's what I'm looking forward to, definitely.
Yeah, I mean, it's really difficult, this federation. So I have a colleague who's trying to join the metagame, and like just even getting onto the Discord channel, right? And Discord doesn't have a feature, for example, and Discord isn't, it's a centralized network and whatever, but Discord could even be, you would want a federated chat, which says, hey, if you're a member in good standing of Token Engineering Commons, we don't have to screen you for being a decent human being, because we already know you've been in Token Engineering Commons for X amount of time, and we just automatically let you into Common Stack. We don't have to do that whole check that you're a person thing every time you join a new DAO. That sucks, man.
Right. Yeah, we kind of have that now. Like the member profiles are displaying what other DAOs you're a member of. So that's something definitely that can be improved upon. Like right now, it's just visible, but the next step would maybe be like having something like the Gitcoin passport, but it's like based on the Meta Alliance DAOs that you're a member of, or something like that. Like the list of DAOs that we consider members of metagame.
Yeah, and imagine a Gitcoin passport where the Gitcoin passport wouldn't just know that you have X number of followers on Twitter, but would know which ones of your posts were the most followed and the words that were mentioned in them. So if you could take my Twitter feed, I mean, I don't use a lot of socials and I don't use them very much, but I definitely have Telegram groups, and I definitely have posts in my Telegram groups where I have a lot more likes, and those tend to be things that have to do with a DAO. Or maybe they're even a third-party thing. Hey, look at this article from Joe Brewer, and then Joe Brewer gets more credit because the thing that I posted that is Joe Brewer talking got a lot of thumbs up. So I got points as a curator, but Joe Brewer is actually the expert that I'm emphasizing, or whatever it is, Griff Green or whoever it is, or Simona Pop, doesn't matter who, but that imagine that you could have some sort of NLP on top of that, and my reputation would be based on, oh, these are the retweets of the most interesting things that Grace said. She must be an expert on this. So imagine that your passport also carried not just you're a real person, but also you're a real person, and this seems to be your expertise.
Right. Yeah, that'd be very cool. And I love the idea of like flowing some reputation back.
And then when you make a proposal, your proposal, it's like, oh, well, Grace doesn't really know a lot about the environment. She's just quoting these other guys, but she knows a lot about DAOs. So her proposals about what to do about the environment are going to have a lower thing, and her proposals about what to do about the DAO are going to have a higher thing. So ranking the proposals not based on the holographic consensus was sort of a popularity mechanism, but this would be more of an expertise mechanism. And there's a lot of room for federating and integrating. And as I said, the information ecology is incredibly important. What is this person's real reputation when they make this proposal?
Right. Yeah. Was there real reputation, and was the reputation in this specific area that they're talking about? I think that's a great point. And I remember like what inspired me to join the DAO space in 2016 was a presentation from Colony, which was displaying like each person would have a reputation, like a specific reputation for different domains or skills, and then that would influence how much decision making power they have and all that sort of stuff. But yeah, now like 5 years later, and it still feels like years away to have this kind of features. But yeah, it's really necessary if you want to move.
I think this kind of leads into the whole question of centralization versus decentralization, because it's great to have Twitter, but then there's censorship. And it's great to have decentralization, but then you can't coordinate. And it's a really interesting question that's come up for me a lot lately around the problems with censorship on Ethereum, which is, on the one hand, you want to say, okay, everybody can have their node wherever they want. And then everybody wants to have their node on Infura or Alchemy because those are where you're going to get the best performance and the lowest price. And then everybody has their nodes in America. And then the US government passes a law against Tornado Cash. And then you have a permissioned network. And this is really the problem, right? It's a bit of you could call it tragedy of the commons. I don't like to use that because here we have a situation where everybody's individual interest caused everybody's group interest to disappear. And I think this is a real big problem whenever we're talking about decentralization. And it's the similar thing with Colony, like you said. This coordination of reputations and neighborhoods is doing something like that on the holochain. And unless we're all working by the same standards, then you don't get good coordination. But if your coordination is too good, then you get capture. And it's a very difficult place to navigate.
Right. Very fine balance. And then a different balance for different things. Yeah, like the tornado cache that you touched on is definitely scary, and like shows how even though like the actual protocol level like is still functional, like people can still use tornado cache on the like if they have their own front end or whatever, like they host themselves. But like if they access that through a centralized utility like Infura that's controlled by people that are under the US law, it makes it a lot more trickier. And like you get, as you said again, a censorship.
Yep. And I think a lot of it comes down to what should be written into the protocol and what shouldn't. I was talking with Sunny Agrawal about this on the Cosmos network, and they've done quite a good job of having very decentralized locations for their relayers and their validators. And at the same time, of course, the 10 biggest validators have most of the power on the network. And there's certain votes that you can see that the top 2 validators that just went through. And so by delegated voting on those networks helps, because it means that people can delegate into a different direction. And if something like that were to happen, where some of the network got censored, people could redelegate their stuff. Both Cosmos and Cardano have delegated networks. And that's very useful for, okay, we're going to move all of our votes to a different location and our delegators. And both Cardano and Cosmos have so many validators that you could easily do that. But there's always sort of a bias towards centralization. Yeah, but those validators, they have more downtime, or they're not paying as high a value, or whatever that is. And so some of the question is, what do you build into the protocol and what don't you build into the protocol? Bitcoin has everything built into the protocol, so it's not subject to capture in that way, but then it can never change. These are really interesting trade-offs, and it really does matter what you're trying to do. So, when you're thinking about, I'm interested what you're thinking about in terms of metagame, like what does it mean to decentralize that? Would it be cool to have 5 different metagames that all have different gameplay, and one is a little bit darker and has more raids and more sort of military type terminology, and the other one has has more like collaborative and cooperation, and maybe the functionality is very similar, but you have to collaborate in order to get your points and your expertise. You can't do it on your own. But of course, then the funding would go in a different direction. Would that be something would still be a metagame? And as these DAOs evolve and as these different teams evolve on metagame, how much independence should they have or could they have in order to continue to really embody the vision that you guys have?
Right. Yeah, that's kind of why we're making this whole separation between what is metagame, what is MetaOS, and what is MetaFam. So, like us as being just the founding project, like the founding guild of metagame, but long term being just one of many projects that are working on metagame. And then the MetaOS as the platform that metagame is built on. So, like having people fork it on their own, like they can uh, like rename everything whatever they want to do, but the base feature should still remain interoperable across the platform. So like the profiles would still work across the platforms or the questing system and all that kind of stuff. And yeah, like the localization is definitely a big thing, like having people able to write different terms or like describe different features in different ways, but have these features still stay interoperable. Like longer term, what we're trying to achieve is having this sort of a user-centric web where people can start through an organization. Right now, like all of these DAO platforms, or not just DAO platform, but like general Web3 platforms are very organization centric. So like on Discord, you have on the left side, you have a bunch of organizations, then you click and you have the organization view, which is unique to each organization. And then especially in DAO space, like each DAO uses a different set of tools. So it's like the whole user experience is kind of a mess. But what we want to do is like have people start their own organization, but really have the ability to customize the platform to their own needs. So like they can operate across different DAOs and have this dashboard where they can get a bigger picture view of like everything that's happening across all of these different DAOs. And they can have their own color scheme. They can have their own localization to like translate it to whatever language or whatever like slang or whatever way they want to operate, but like have the base features still work across regardless of how they look or how they're arranged or how they're labeled. So I'm definitely thinking about those kinds of problems, and I'm glad you mentioned it.
So yeah, I think that the user-centric web is really important, and I think self-sovereign identity is really important. I think one of the disservices that some people in our industry are doing is trying to create new thoughts and new standards through, let's say, POAPs or non-transferable NFTs. Like, I'm going to know your identity by the NFTs in your wallet. And that is a pretty poor architecture. And we could really benefit a lot in our industry from listening to the 20 years of history of the self-sovereign identity people, looking at the standards for digital identifiers and verifiable credentials, and Evan from what's it called, Disco, right? She has this idea of this backpack, and she's really using the best of Web 2 and Web 3 in terms of identity and self-sovereign identity that is user-centric and the ability to bring your reputation with you. There's also some interesting work being done with neighborhoods on Holochain around this, also adhering to the DID standards. And I think that that's really important, looking at those DID and verified credential standards that have been developed over all this time. And you're seeing from that community saying, oh, blockchain offers us the ability. And I think you're right that this holding your own identity and being user-centric is essential for this working. Yeah. And the other thing I think that you mentioned a couple of times was this issue of money and funding. And I don't think anybody really wants to look at this, but it also connects to what we were talking about with the servers, and it connects to Priceless, which is what I'm working on, is, well, where is the hardware coming from? And where is the electricity coming from? And where is the cloud server coming from? And because we don't own any of these resources ourselves as a network, we're very vulnerable. And I think that this is, it's essential. When you think about a sustainable network, it's like, well, where are you getting the electricity and where are you getting the water? And if you're always getting those from the default system and you don't have any plan for your own housing or your own food or your own hardware or your own electricity, then you're always going to be asking for money from somebody who does have those things. And that's kind of a conversation nobody wants to have.
Right. Yeah, it goes all the way back to electricity and chips and where does that stuff come from? We like to think that it's all in the cloud and it's all on the blockchain, so it's decentralized, but unfortunately, not the case.
Yeah, I mean that's really where I started with my project around Priceless, is saying, okay, look, you don't have an ecosystem unless you can support the bodies in the ecosystem and the humans in the ecosystem. And how could we, again, we talked about Regens Unite. How can we integrate the best of what we're doing in Web3 with the best of what we're doing in the intentional community and eco villages, and how do we actually create a self-sufficient parallel system that isn't running by the same rules as the default system? We know that the systems that we're in right now centralize power and they centralize financial resources. And so far, we've done a really good job of accelerating that in Web3. And a few projects have been able to decentralize power, but not very well. And we've also become more and more male dominated with this centralization of power. It's interesting. I'm not really sure what the correlation is, except that I see it with my own eyes. It's very difficult to be a woman in this industry in terms of you're just in the minority all the time, and there's a certain way of thinking that is dominant. And so if we wanted to create a more regenerative system, a more collaborative system, what would that look like? And PricelessDAO really starts with, okay, well, first of all, we actually need regional networks of physical living together. And this is kind of the opposite of Balaji in some ways. Balaji's all like, okay, we're going to start with digital communities and then we're going to settle down. And it sounds good, except if you've ever tried to live with even one person, you know that it's really hard. And so Priceless is starting from, okay, how do you start with the basics? How do you start with the electricity? How do you start with creating, I'm just going to sort of say conceptually, right? This isn't exactly what we're saying, but creating a home or a neighborhood or a co-living place where a bunch of programmers live. They do some farming. They have their own solar power or wind power or water power. And they start to be self-sufficient so that they can develop the Web3 infrastructure, the tools and the infrastructure and the either monetary, in our case, non-monetary systems, and start to become self-sufficient. And how do you create multiple hubs like that? And then you add on top of that your Gitcoin passport, or, you know, if you, or your reputation system, or your, what's it called? Kong passport. I don't know if you've looked at these Kong. You were on that Twitter space with me in the Kongland people who create hardware, who create chips and create physical passports with a chip in it. And let's say that's attached to your Gitcoin passport, and you can move from place to place within this alternative actually networked state, which has land. And I think Balaji's vision is much more about interdependence between that and the existing system. And the PricelessDAO vision is more about, what if we created a completely parallel system and we didn't need that system because we want a regenerative system. We want a system that says a live tree is better than a dead tree, and a system that honors parenting and that honors human equality and that doesn't centralize power. And so to me, that's all about thinking about our independence as a network. And again, that's a conversation people don't really want to have. But I think if we really want to create alternative economies and alternative decision-making methods, we definitely have to be less than 100% dependent on the default system. And right now we're pretty close to 100% dependence.
Right.
The question is it's a hard conversation because what does it take to be independent? And it's a lot more work to be independent than to do yield farming. Physical farming is much harder than yield farming, as it turns out.
Yeah, nobody wants to talk about these very basics, and not even just the hardware, but just like how to relate to each other and how to live with each other. And I think it's no wonder that you're familiar with Richard Bartlett. Like he was really with the The Occupy Wall Street. So he was in that, and he was really into decentralized organizations and all of that for like 10 years. And now these days he's teaching micro solidarity. So he moved like, okay, so I'm interested in decentralized organizations, but what's most important is that people know how to first relate to each other, like one on one, then how to relate to small groups and how to work in small groups, live with each other, and like be good to each other and all of that kind of stuff. Like before we try to do anything on a bigger scale, like let's get down the basics.
Yeah, Dag Hammarskjöld, who I'm not sure I'm saying his name correctly, the first Secretary General of the UN, said it was harder to get along with one person than with the whole world. But I
Yeah.
think that I think the other thing that we're saying in our industry, and we're saying, and Occupy is saying, well, Occupy started saying, but we're saying in our movement as well, is we can't trust the existing authorities to make these changes, and we need to make our own system. And I think that's accurate. I don't think we're at a point in history where we can expect the authorities or our political elite or our corporations to make these changes for us. They're not going to. And then it's a question of where the power is. And people have tremendous power, but if you're going to use your power, you have to use your power. And it's much harder to do potato farming than yield farming.
Right.
And if you're looking for easy money, and it's much easier to get money and buy things at the supermarket than to become independent, then you're always going to keep looking to the government because the government is in control of that. That's a really hard conversation to have with people.
Right.
You're powerful, but only if you can say up yours to the authority.
Right. Yeah. People want it to be decentralized, but don't want it to be hard.
Yeah,
Most people just choose convenience, like over.
that's right. We want to be decentralized, but we want to go to the gas station. It's like, well,
Yeah, and not install the solar panels, but plug into the local, well, not the local grid, the the city grid.
yeah. And I think a lot of us, probably most of us, are in certainly in the regenerative movement, but also a lot of us in this crypto movement. Either you're complete degen and you're making your full living from this, or you have two jobs. And one job is the things you believe in and creating these DAOs and creating regenerative civilizations. You know, with me, priceless is priceless, right? What does it mean, priceless? It means I'm not making money there. My money is going into that. And I have a job somewhere else. So I write white papers, as you know, and I've written more than 100 white papers, and it pays the rent and it pays for my regenerative work. And so that's not a highly sustainable model for many people. My children are adults, so that's my hobby, and so it's fine. But for most people, that's not a very sustainable model of I'm going to do work to regenerate the earth, and then I'm also going to have a job. And we see that with the eco-village movement over the years, and we see that with all kinds of regenerative movement. That's not a very sustainable system. And we are seeing young people just opt out, like, I'm not going to have money, I'm going to live in debt or live off my parents or whatever. I mean, the whole system seems to be very difficult to sustain. And I think each of us makes an individual decision and has different decision paths of like, how do you manage that?
Right. Yeah, it's hard, and I think it shouldn't be like that, but it's just the way it is because it's hard to get funding for any of this regenerative stuff, and it goes back to what I said previously. Like in crypto, everybody wants to support the revolution insofar as it makes them rich, and they're not gonna invest much in the regen stuff. They're not gonna invest much in the DAOs either, unless they promise high returns. And there's a lot of stuff in crypto that does promise high returns. So it's been kind of annoying.
Well, freedom isn't free.
Right.
But I think that's really where we've come to at Priceless. And I know you wanted me to say a little bit about Priceless. I did a couple of interesting funding, attempts. One was, it was during the pandemic, and we thought, what if we could create like these kind of expensive experience, like 6 month or a year experience, is in eco villages, because you couldn't travel at the time. And, maybe high net worth people would want to live in an eco village for a year and have this kind of personal development, homesteading. I'm going to live like my ancestors lived with my children for a year kind of experience. And that didn't go anywhere. I mean, it was fun to think about and to plan that, but that didn't end up funding it. And then recently we were going to launch a DAO, like something like the Constitution DAO or the Assange DAO. I'm like, well, if they raised $50 million, I could raise $50 million. Our thing is just as good as, it's aligned with Assange DAO. Like, we're really about freedom and about independence. And yeah, I don't think I had a good concept of how much work that was going to be. And at some point we decided that we don't want to spend, and I've got a few co-founders, we're all women, that we don't want to spend our lives doing that, trying to look for money and trying to get it funded. But actually, we're starting a ground up movement of women. And we recognize that we're going to need a whole paradigm shift around how do you do these things? What does decentralized governance look like? How do we address the meta crisis? How do we address new forms of democracy? How do we not end up financializing everything that is priceless? And we don't know where this is going to go, but we're going to start gathering first full moon in January. We're putting up a website now, and really any female woman is invited. And to kind of create a counterbalance to these think tanks that are mostly male dominated, and these conversations, whether it's sort of, you could look at something like the Stoa or Rebel Wisdom or any of these crypto DAOs, and this very male dominated conversation where my feeling is that we've tried to create more equality in those conversations for 50 years and failed. And so let's try to create a separate women's space and then bring in men at the right time, instead of let's try to push women into men's spaces. And that's where Priceless is starting, is let's try to create a different type of movement. I don't know what's going to happen, but I did realize that myself and my co-founders, we've all done fundraising in the past, both in the nonprofit and for-profit world, and none of us wanted to go through that again. We just felt that a lot of what we're trying to explain just never makes sense in a capital-dominated world, and we need to start a new conversation. And so that's really where that's taken a turn to. I mean, we have some really interesting models that we want to fund or execute without funding, and we're starting to explore that. What are these new models, and how is that going to look, and how do we create a counterbalance to the thinking that has been dominated in the DAO space, as well as the crypto space, as well as the regenerative space, very coming from this kind of capitalist male dominated world. And I don't know, right? I mean, we may not come up with the same thing. It may be no better. I don't know, but it's got a lot of momentum. People have, the women I've been talking to, everybody says, yes, I want to try it. So that's kind of an interesting turn that we've taken, is to say, hey, wait, we're not willing to play that game anymore.
So that was like happening over the past 3 months. Yeah, the less we talked about it, you were still planning to do the fundraise. That was at Regions Unite in October.
Yep. Yeah. So I gave that a go in November. And I just, again, one of the problems is the coordination mechanisms. Like, I have a tremendous network, but how do I get that network to all tweet something out the same day, and to everybody give us a little bit, and to everybody contact the people who they know? And it was a much bigger coordination effort than I really was prepared to make. And also, I think a month or two after that, I started meeting people and talking to people really specifically about the project. And I recognized that there's a real gap between the people who have money, that they've won in this game, right? They've won in the existing capitalism game. And what I'm trying to do is say, I want to create a totally different game. I want to create a game where children win. Most of the games that we're playing right now in the crypto world as well is, you can win if you work and you put in time and you contribute. And you can't win if you're busy taking care of your children or your mother or whatever that is. And that's inhumane. And the purpose of society should be to have society. And if people don't get born and get raised, then you don't have society. That's kind of a self-terminating idea, is that only the people who can do non-family work should gain from the system. That's a crazy system. That's the system we're in. And it's caused, the destruction of family and depression and all kinds of, we've seen it everywhere. Everywhere that's more civilized, in quotes, has less relationships between families. The more civilized you are, the more detached you are from your friends and family. It's what's civilized about that? And so, yeah, so explaining that to somebody who's won in the capitalist system, they have a lot of money and they're really good at it. Trying to explain to them what's wrong with the system is very difficult. It's more like, well, yeah, but anybody could have done what I did and achieved what I achieved. And it's like, yeah, anybody could, but 99.9% of the people didn't. So do we really want a system where anybody could, but most people don't?
Right. And if everybody does, it won't be good for the society. That's also part of the
It won't be good even for most of the individuals.
right.
And I'm not saying rich people are less happy. Of course, that's ridiculous. Everybody has their struggles in life and everybody has their joy in life. But it's like, do we really want that? Yeah. And certainly the environment can't sustain those lifestyles for everybody. Not everybody can fly around in private jets. Even air traffic control couldn't handle that, much less the environment.
Right. Yeah, I can't say about rich people in general, but I can say that I haven't really met fulfilled degens, like people who made a lot of money in the DeFi space, that are really that they're actually really happy people who live fulfilling and balanced lives. I just, I mean, not that I met a shit ton of people who are like that, but yeah, I can't say that I met people who overlap in those things.
I mean, yeah, it runs a range, right? There's a range of people in different spaces, right? So, yeah, some are, some aren't. Who knows, right?
But yeah, like the care work and the kind of work that women do, like for children and stuff, like has always been not paid, or like general, like this kind of not just care work but also emotional work. It's like not paid at all. And then the whole women's movement that I just ended up with more women working and less children being taken care of. Like also not so great. Like as you said, like how the civilized societies creates an even bigger disconnect, because then you just have women who try to be, yeah, doing the same shit that we do, which is not great. Like we are not supposed to be doing it either. Like let alone like get other people to do it as well. So yeah.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I never really thought about it in those terms, but if you looked at like how many women are fulfilled at being parents, or even men who are parents who are fulfilled by that, you'll see that there is a strong correlation. Taking care of your children is incredibly fulfilling work.
Right. A
You
lot
don't
of
have to
the
pay me to do it or anything.
right. Yeah, that's a good point.
But yeah, but
Definitely
we do want a society where the priority is bringing up great people.
hard stuff. It's both hard and rewarding, as opposed to a lot of the stuff that makes a lot of money, which is makes a lot of money, but it's not very fulfilling.
Well, like that's the nature of life, isn't it? When you work hard for something and you get it, you feel great. If you get something you didn't really deserve, you don't feel great. I mean, if you think about people who've made a lot of money versus people who are Olympic athletes, and there's certainly overlap, but when you become an Olympic athlete and you get that gold medal, like, wow, that is an accomplishment. And you've gotten to the top. When you make money, you don't get to the top. There's like another person above you always. And that is kind of a recipe for dissatisfaction.
You're right. Always looking up and moving that goalpost. Definitely one of the things that's wrong with how people live. Although we shouldn't be talking too much about how people should live, but yeah, I haven't seen many people who live happy lives by keep on moving this goalpost like that.
Well, the relevance to that is tokenomics, right? Tokenomics is a cumulative number that always goes up. So if you think, we were talking before about reputation, so this section might be more related to that discussion about reputation. Reputation is usually 1 to 10 and Olympic medal, right? It's like he's really great, and then there's like off the charts, but it's like 1 to 10, right? Like, where am I in my knowledge about this? Where am I in my physical abilities? Sort of 1 to 10, and or 1 to 100, something like that. And when you start giving tokens for that, it starts being really weird. Like, how much, and again, I really do like what Giveth and those people are doing there in the token engineering commons, but like how many praise points you have is a cumulative number. So it's not really your reputation. It's like how much you put into that community over how much time. And you could be much better at something than somebody with more points than you, because they just kind of plugged along for a long time and you just joined, but you're an expert. And so this actually really relates to tokenomics. When there's always a number that could get bigger and bigger and bigger, your incentives look very different than, well, I'm already a 9.5 and I'm not going to get to a 9.6, or maybe I will, but it's like, I'm not trying to get cumulative. So I think that the comparison between how you feel when you win that Olympic gold medal or how you feel when you make another $1 million, I'll just call it another million just for the sake of argument, and what's next for you looks really different. And so when engineering our tokens and our incentive systems, we need to think about those as very different places in terms of human satisfaction.
Right. Yeah, designing like not just organization, but also like having people try to live more holistically. But yeah, focusing on organizations, like yeah, it's always this problem of focusing on just one metric, and it often turns out, okay, what we're gonna focus on, what's easiest to measure, profit, and then that becomes the main goal. Whereas, okay, your DAO is profitable, but how happy are the people that are a part of your DAO? Like, let's have these other metrics to see like to measure success in other domains, like not just how much money you make, but like what's the impact, what's the well-being, that kind of stuff. And yeah, then back to the people themselves, like having it set in their minds that like they're not supposed to just chase this one metric, but the goal is to live a good life, I guess. And like maybe you want to make an impact, and that's a good thing to focus on, but not just like grinding that single metric, but try to develop in multiple directions.
Yeah, and just one more note on community, which is really interesting because we talk about these online communities, but I don't know of any online communities that pay any attention to what I'm going to call offboarding, right? What happens when somebody quits, or do you know that somebody's quits? And, if you work at a cable or telecommunications company, they run a lot of AI to know when somebody might end up canceling their subscription. And they send you, and you've been in this position, right? Some organization has sent you a special offer because they know that you haven't been using your TV very much or whatever it is, or your subscription very much. And they know you're about to cancel, and they suddenly send you an offer for 3 free months or a 50% discount or a bonus because they have the statistics on that. And I'm saying that because we're saying we want to build community, but we never have any statistics or pay attention to, hey, so-and-so who used to be really active is less active now. And we also have no system in place of they quit. Somebody go after them and talk to them. What happened? Did we not care about them? Did they not get elected for the position that they wanted? And so if you're trying to build community, I don't know of any community who has an offboarding or metrics process where they start to understand who's dissatisfied. We have rage quit. I'm like, oh yeah, that's great.
Yeah, we're doing actually more of that, like outreach to people who became, who stopped being active, to see like how they are doing and what's the reason, to see like how we can either help them or improve metagame. And actually, now that we kind of nailed the onboarding process, I added it to my notes like a month ago to like work on the offboarding. I think it's especially important in metagame, which is meant to be this starting point for people. So it's kind of like natural for people to be active in metagame for a while and then go on to work in other DAOs. So yeah, I think it's super important to have this offboarding, not just to learn about how to make the organization better and how to help these people who might have left for whatever reason, but also like because it's natural that people at some point lose interest in this project and want to move on, and we want to support them in that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'm running my workshop next week again, and every time I run the workshop, which is once a year, it's starting on Tuesday. I don't know if this will go live before then and people can join, but every time I run it, people are like, we're going to continue the community. And I'm like, yeah, go ahead and try. There's a Telegram group and whatever, but it doesn't work like that. You do a workshop, the workshop ends and you move on. That's perfectly fine.
Right.
It's not designed that way.
Yeah, I had the same experience with the micro solidarity course, because you start feeling close to the people, even though it's just one course. And then somebody suggested we should continue the community, and yeah, Richard was just like kind of put on a smile and said, "Yeah, you can try."
I'm trying to work on a campus type idea with the bioregional regenerators group. That there was a bioregional council and they had it on the Kiko chat, and I'm starting to talk about them. How do we use that same platform as like a campus where multiple courses happen, so that you do, and then maybe there's a coffee shop on the campus, and what would a virtual campus look like? I'm interested in that, because there always are people who want to either continue the conversation, or maybe they come back a month later and they have a question they'd like to ask the group. And what would happen if you had that virtual campus? So you don't have to keep it going all the time, but if you want to present your project, you can go into that campus and say, hey, on this date, I'm going to present my project. And maybe you reach out to maybe it has some way that you can reach out to the people who were in the course with you, as well as to the general public. And a lot of these things, by the way, with outreach are extremely hard in our industry, because if you look at DAOs, right, how do you tell people vote is coming up? I missed all this Gitcoin stuff and I hold Gitcoin tokens, but there's no way to notify me as a MetaMask user that a vote is coming up.
Right.
These are really tough problems
Yeah.
that because of the architecture we've chosen, that we're facing.
Yeah, that's why unfortunately email is still so important. I think, like having actual subscription lists, and that's why we're working on the dashboard to give people a big review, because there's a bunch of different DAO frameworks, there's a bunch of different bounty platforms. Like there really needs to be a place for people to get an overview of like everything that they're involved with, rather than having to go to each of these different websites to check it out. It's just not possible. But yeah, I'm glad that we zoomed out a bit out of this decentralized organizing to kind of the bigger picture, and you touched upon the session that you got started, that you got going next week. So we will definitely try to push this out before then, and we had retweet or whatever we can to help promote the workshop.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, we have about 5 spaces left. It's really for anybody who's doing any kind of project and they want to think, what will my tokenomics look like? What will my DAO look like? What will my community look like? So that's really who it's for. Yeah, you can join.
Yeah, yeah, I could personally join. That's true. Yeah, I was just thinking about how to promote it and help get more people in that, but it actually would be useful for myself as well.
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll do that, and I hope you will joining us for MetaFest. We mentioned that we are planned on working on it when we met at Regents Unite, but now it's set in stone. So it's official, it's happening, and I will reach out to you about that.
And that's going to be in Croatia?
It's going to be in Croatia, August 16th until 18th, so 3 days in Croatia for anybody interested in the DAO space and region stuff. That's kind of the two main topics. So
I
yeah.
will put it in my calendar. It's going to be I'm going to be traveling a lot. And as you know, I travel by train now. I don't travel by bus. So Croatia is great, but I have to be in London I think on the 27th or something. So it's like, okay. But yeah, perfect. I'm excited.
Yeah, at least it's just a little bit in the opposite direction, just a few hours.
Yeah, it's not too far. Yeah. No, I mean,
Yeah,
Croatia's near to me. Croatia's driving distance for me. So
great. Great. Yeah, hope to see you there, and I hope to see a lot of the listeners of this podcast as well. And yeah, thank you for coming on. This was great.
awesome. Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. I always love speaking to you. You have such a broad vision, but also the ability to execute a profoundly successful project and get people together. So it's just great to talk to people and be in touch with people who have that balance of the practical and the bigger picture.
Awesome. Well, appreciate the kind words. And yeah, have a great day and talk to you soon.
All right, take care.